They both started working at a pizza place in downtown Hanahan.
They wanted to get part-time jobs to help supplement their income.
Instead, they would become victims of a terrifying attack.
It seemed like a really grotesque form of torture. He tried to make them suffer.
I was certain he was going to kill us.
And the ensuing investigation would lead detectives on a nationwide manhunt for a serial killer hell-bent on revenge.
With every murder he committed, he felt like he was getting even.
This would rank right up there with the worst of them, if not the worst.
December 4th, 1985. It's another quiet night in the small town of Hanahan, South Carolina. Until a little after 2 a.m., when an injured man stumbles into the police station on Yeamans Hall Road, covered in blood.
The dispatcher on duty sees this guy come in, and from the looks of his wounds, it's clear he's been in some type of shooting.
I think there were 3 or 4 gunshots to his head, as I recall. Because of the gunshot wounds, he was bleeding profusely. As you might imagine, a very dramatic scene.
He'd been shot in the head, straight into his mouth.
They immediately notified the police units as well as the fire and EMS, which was right next door to us.
Paramedics quickly arrived to administer first aid. In addition to his injuries, they noticed 2 other strange details.
As they're working on him, they realize the shirt he's wearing is actually a pizza delivery uniform, and it looks like he'd been tied up.
He had a piece of phone cord wrapped around his wrist, where apparently he'd been tied up.
They immediately get an ambulance to transport him to the hospital, and the police officer hops in the ambulance trying to reassure him and find information.
It's obviously difficult for him to communicate, but he was able to tell them there was a robbery at the pizzeria where he worked.
He had managed to drive his truck about a block from the store and then had managed to stumble into the police department on foot. I have no idea other than that was God's will for him to make it there.
Officers are dispatched to the location, where they encounter a disturbing scene.
The door was open, the lights were on. It was in disarray in certain areas, particularly the office and behind the counter. There was blood all over, and the phone cords had been removed.
It looked like the aftermath of a robbery. The cash register and the safe were both open, and the cash was gone.
They also find a second victim in the back of the store.
It was another young man in the same uniform as the first victim. He'd been shot in the head, and he didn't survive.
He was tied and bound with a telephone cord, and he was deceased.
From their driver's licenses, police are able to identify the 2 unfortunate pizza shop employees. A pair of 24-year-old men named Gary Melky and Christopher Zare.
Chris was originally from Oakley, Kansas, and Gary was from Morehead City, North Carolina. They were both raised in very supportive families. Chris and Gary were pretty close friends. They had been in the service together and known each other for many years.
After Gary and Chris completed their naval training in the 1980s, they'd both been stationed in Charleston, South Carolina.
Back in the 1980s, we had a big Navy presence in the Charleston area, and Gary and Chris worked at the Naval Hospital, and basically the Naval Hospital treated Navy people and their dependents. They probably weren't making a big wage doing that, so they wanted to get part-time jobs to help supplement their income.
They both started working at a pizza place in downtown Hanahan.
Chris helped make and deliver pizzas, while Gary worked his way up to assistant store manager.
It's probably not the kind of job 2 Navy guys are looking to turn into a career, but it paid the bills.
They're working really late hours to make ends meet. By all accounts, they're just outstanding and upstanding citizens.
But it seemed their part-time jobs had put the 2 men in the wrong place at the wrong time. An armed robbery has left Chris dead and Gary on his way to the hospital in critical condition. And investigators are combing the store for clues.
Basically, there was no DNA known at the time. You could do blood samples and you could do fingerprinting and those kind of things. We had Charleston County's crime scene unit come over because they were really well equipped to process the crime scene.
Fingerprints were going to be hard to isolate there because every customer and worker probably left prints there, but they did come up with one crucial piece of evidence.
One of the bullets had exited the head of one of the victims, and we went back, and up under the counter, we found where one had stuck in the wall, and we dug it out. It was a .25 caliber weapon.
Based on the evidence, it appears the thief had entered the pizza parlor around midnight, just before closing time.
The assailant probably waited until they were the only two people left in the shop and then pulled a gun on Gary and Chris. Well, since Gary was the assistant manager, he was forced to open the cash drawer and the safe.
Someone with a loaded weapon was able to get Chris there and Gary Melky on the floor, proceeded to use the phone cords that were available there in the business to tie them up.
He tied both of them up and then ransacked and took whatever he could, primarily the cash. I think that was a little over $1,100 had been stolen.
Any hope they might have had that their assailant would take the money and run quickly vanished.
The robber apparently decided not to leave any witnesses, so he shot Chris in the head at point-blank range.
I can only think what Gary Melky was thinking. Obviously, he knew he was going to be next, and he was next.
Amazingly, even after he was shot and left for dead, he was able to stay alive long enough to get to the police station.
But will Gary survive long enough to identify the killer? Coming up, police discover this isn't just a robbery gone wrong, but something far more sinister.
The entire case, it just had tremendous shock value.
Detectives in Hanahan, South Carolina are investigating a shooting at a local pizza parlor that has left Chris Zare dead and Gary Melky in the hospital.
They were both shot execution style. Chris died instantly, but Gary was somehow able to survive.
ER doctors worked quickly to stabilize Gary's wounds.
He'd been shot 4 times in the temple, the jaw, the base of his skull, and his neck. It must have been touch and go for a while. One of the officers went with Gary to the hospital. Once hospital workers cleared his mouth of blood enough for him to talk, he asked if he could describe the shooter.
To their surprise, Gary says he knows exactly who shot him. A recently hired fellow Domino's employee named Mitchell Sims.
Gary was screaming in pain, but he was able to give a pretty good description of Sims, including the color of his hair.
We contacted the store manager, and he came to the scene, and he pulled Mitchell Sims' application and provided it to us.
According to his records, Mitch was a 25-year-old part-time employee. He had not been working there very long.
When investigators contact Mitchell's family, however, they learn he has a checkered past. Mitchell Carlton Sims was raised in Columbia, South Carolina, as the youngest of 3 children.
What we learned in talking to the family was he had come from a broken home.
He apparently grew up in relatively humble beginnings. There may have been some abuse in his life.
At 18, he had enlisted in the Army, but he was forced to leave after only 2 years.
He had been dishonorably discharged after an incident there when he tried to frame a fellow soldier for shooting him.
He got involved with the wife of a military officer and came up with some kind of a plan where one of his buddies was going to shoot Mitchell, and then hopefully the husband of this woman would get the blame, and then Mitchell and she could be together. Now, this was a harebrained scheme that the authorities quickly saw through. The only person that was really hurt was Mitchell, because he actually was shot in the leg by his friend.
And then the military, through their investigation, they wound up charging him, and he did some time at Fort Leavenworth.
When he got out of prison in 1980, Mitch was 20 years old. He returned to Columbia, where he married a childhood friend, Teresa.
She was only 16 at the time, but she seemed to be the more mature of the two. They wound up having 3 kids together.
She kept him pretty well balanced, and she was a very nice lady.
In January of 1985, Mitch started working as a manager at a Domino's Pizza in Columbia.
On the surface, it appeared as though he was actually getting some level of success. And he was highly regarded and was doing very well. And then there was a dispute about the low pay.
And apparently he had a falling out with his boss and had his bonus cut. He was upset.
Instead of moving on, Mitchell had apparently decided to fight back.
When he didn't get the bonus he felt he was entitled to, he tried to stage a coup with the other employees and get everyone to resign in protest.
He became involved in a strike against the company, but his coworkers did not join him, and so he was very bitter about that.
In May of that year, Mitchell even sent a formal complaint to corporate headquarters, but he never got a response and ultimately quit his job.
He was upset the way he was treated. He was disgruntled.
He did a series of odd jobs after that, but he could never make enough money to pay all the bills for the wife and the 3 kids, and she was very unhappy about that.
It put a lot of stress on the marriage, and it led to Mitch having an affair with a young woman he met during the strike.
The young woman's name was Ruby Paget.
She's only 18 or 19 years old. I just sort of saw her as a person that was crying out for some love and some attention.
She came from a terrible background, and she'd run away from home and worked various low-level jobs and done a lot of drinking and drugging. And there were 2 lost souls that came together.
Mitchell ultimately left his wife and children to be with Ruby. They moved into a trailer together in North Charleston.
He was drinking more and more, and he was involved with Ruby, who liked to drink and do marijuana and speed or whatever else she could get her hands on, and so Mitchell joined her in that.
Ruby wasn't working, so Mitch had to support her too, and it didn't seem like she was all that happy with his effort.
What little income that he could earn was squandered on alcohol and drugs.
In November of 1985, Mitchell swallowed his pride and applied for a job at a different Domino's franchise, this time in Hanahan, South Carolina. But after only 2 weeks, it already wasn't going well.
They'd given him a part-time job delivering pizzas, but a couple of weeks after he started, his truck broke down and he couldn't afford to fix it, which means he couldn't deliver pizzas. He was basically worse off than when he started.
Considering Mitchell's history, it's not difficult to believe the setback could have driven him to commit armed robbery.
That was his way of getting money. He knew how the system operated. He knows where the cash is kept.
This is all because of his bruised ego over not getting a bonus.
Coming up, investigators' search for their suspect becomes a nationwide manhunt.
He went on a crime spree, and he wanted to get revenge. He had a hunger to kill.
South Carolina police are looking for 25-year-old Mitchell Sims, who has been accused of murdering one coworker and leaving another fighting for his life after an armed robbery.
He already had the money when he shot them both execution style and close range in the head. It was very gruesome.
From talking to family members, they know that he's living in a trailer with his 20-year-old girlfriend, Ruby Paget. They just don't know where she fits into all this yet.
Investigators obtain the couple's address from Mitchell's job application.
We then met with North Charleston Police Department because the residence was in their jurisdiction. And we went over there, but we couldn't locate exactly which mobile home he lived in. We got a search warrant for it. And we went back over there the next morning, and that's when we found out which one he lived in.
But when officers enter the trailer, they quickly realize that they're too late.
During that time gap, Mitchell Sims and Ruby Paget, they were able to escape.
We had an officer to go to the airport and check with all the airlines there. We had officers go to the bus station. We were checking all the motels in the area. It was all over the police radios.
The police told us Mitch Sims' name as soon as they found out because they needed the media's help to spread the word. They did give a picture out to all the local TV stations just in case he was still in the area.
We ultimately developed some information that he might have taken a bus out of Charleston. And that's when we got with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and they sent a couple agents out to work with us.
While the manhunt expands, investigators receive another piece of bad news.
Following surgery, Gary fell into a coma and never woke up. He died less than a week after the shooting. After everything he had been through, that was heartbreaking. Unfortunately, it also meant police wouldn't have his testimony, and that was their only evidence at that point.
With no witness and no leads, the case seems to be getting colder with each passing day. Until December 10th, a week after the armed robbery in Hanahan, South Carolina, police 2,500 miles away in Glendale, California, get a surprising call.
A young man named Richard Wagner says he has information about a robbery that happened at a pizza store in Glendale.
Richard Wagner walked in just to visit his coworkers because he also worked there, but he was off duty that night and saw this individual who he didn't know.
Richard says the stranger came out of the back wearing an employee's shirt and answered the phone as if he worked there.
Something about it felt immediately off to him. Nobody in the store was acting the way they normally would.
His friends who were working there treated him strangely as if they didn't know him, so he quickly became suspicious.
He also saw him smoking a cigarette, which was a no-no under company policy.
Richard called his boss at a payphone. He agreed to meet Richard at the store to find out what's going on. But when they got there, they couldn't see anyone at all. They immediately called police.
Officers arrive within minutes. At first glance, the store appears to be empty. But when they open the walk-in cooler, they make a gruesome discovery.
There were 2 employees inside hanging from storage racks. They were standing on boxes and gasping for breath.
It seemed like a really grotesque form of torture. They were tied with their hands behind their back, with the rope going over a rack and the other end around their neck. They were having a great deal of trouble staying up off their toes so that they wouldn't choke to death.
Police quickly cut them down. The 2 victims turn out to be 41-year-old delivery driver Ed Sycam and 19-year-old assistant manager Corey Spearoff.
They gave us jackets and blankets or whatever else they had to try to warm us up. They immediately started the questioning of just, what's the story, what happened?
Corey tells them that Ed stayed behind to help him close up for the night. Another employee, John Harrigan, was out making his last delivery.
I had already pulled the cash and I was making up my bank deposits. I heard someone come into the store.
Corey goes out front thinking it's John, but instead he finds 2 customers, a man with dark hair and a skinny blonde woman.
Corey tells police that before he could even say they were closed, the man pulled out a gun.
My whole being was sucked right into that barrel. Very calm. He just said, go back in the office. Ed was standing just off to the side, and he saw what was going on. He was instructed to come over, and we both went into the office. She had a long butcher knife. She was the one who was basically collecting the money, so I was giving the money to her. This was probably the perfect time for them to approach and rob us. It was the very end of the night. We were minutes from closing. We would have already begun to accumulate any cash or monies in the store to make the bank deposits.
Corey says he warned the couple that their delivery driver would be returning soon, but they didn't seem to care.
I said, if you hear someone come running in the door, don't panic. He's due back any moment now.
Corey said the man just took off his sweater and showed him what he had on underneath it. It was a pizza delivery uniform with John's name on it.
He sort of laughed and said, no, I don't think so. It was alarming. A whole bunch of thoughts go through your head on what happened, where's John?
Once the robbers collected all the money, they told Corey and Ed to both face the wall.
The wall, he had the gun up, extended out, and I was certain at that point that was when he was going to kill us.
But at that exact moment, they hear someone come into the store.
At that very moment, someone called out, hey, is there anybody here? So I looked back at him and said, what do you want me to do? And he put the gun on my head and said, don't do anything stupid. I'm going to blow this guy away.
Coming up, another victim with a familiar MO.
The taking and killing of the employee, and then the way he tied the other employees up. He knew the ins and outs of the pizza operation.
Manager Corey Spearoff is telling Glendale police the harrowing story of a couple who robbed his pizza store at gunpoint. Corey believes the man was just about to kill him and his employee when they were interrupted.
Someone calls out from the front of the store, so he sends Corey to go deal with it while he holds Ed hostage. He gets out there and immediately recognizes his coworker, Richard Wagner, but he doesn't want him to get pulled into this too, so he plays it off like he doesn't know him.
I didn't acknowledge that I knew him. He sort of looked at me funny, didn't say anything outright, but he was trying to get my attention. And I continued to look down. I didn't acknowledge him. I asked him again, "What would you like to order?"
Luckily, Richard played along.
While Corey is taking Richard's order, the phone rings. At this point, the robber comes out from the office. He can't chance the fact that Corey won't call out for help.
He picked up the phone, answered, said, "Thank you for calling. This is Mitch. How can I help you?" And proceeded to take an order for a delivery.
Corey finishes ringing up Richard's pizza and tells him to go outside and wait in the car. He'll bring it out when it's done. But at that point, Richard has figured out what's going on and he calls police.
Corey says that's when the man calling himself Mitch decided to leave them in the walk-in cooler, and he'd come prepared with a rope.
He said, "Put your arms behind your back," and he took the end of the rope and looped it over the top of a metal shelf and pulled that back down and tied off around my neck. During the process of being tied, and I was in first, he brought Ed in, tied him, and I believe Ed was complaining a bit about how tight it was, or he was choking. The response very simply was, "So at least you're alive." We didn't know what was next. We didn't know if he was going to open the door and shoot us. We didn't know what was going to happen at that point. If we came off of our toes, we'd strangle. No matter how you move, no matter what you do, you're in pain. Your legs, your ankles, your calves are hurting, screaming. It's cold. It's probably 35 degrees in the cooler. By this time, we're bound, so we've got a loss of circulation. We've been in the cold for a while. So your fingers just don't even really work that well.
They couldn't, they were too cold. They would have died there, but for the fact that police were on their way. In fact, it was Richard Wagner's quick action that saved their lives.
Corey is thankful that he and Ed survived, but he's worried about what Mitch might have done to his other driver.
Corey told the police that John Harrigan had gone to make a delivery and had never come back, and that the person who robbed them had returned wearing Harrigan's shirt and name badge.
I asked him, "Where's John? What happened with John?" He said, "They'll find him after they find you."
Corey gave police the address for the last delivery, which was a motel not far from the store. When they get there, no one answers the door, so they get the manager to let them in. The first thing they notice is the sound of water running in the bathroom.
Inside, police find the dead body of a man submerged in the tub. He's been hogtied and gagged with a pillowcase over his head.
When homicide investigators get there, they notice the rope used to hogtie the victim is the same kind used on Ed and Corey, but it's still unclear if he died of strangulation or drowning.
The victim is identified as 21-year-old John Harrigan.
They robbed him of his pizza money, of his truck, his keys, and even his clothing.
Young man like that he would end up drowned in the bathtub over delivering a pizza. How could someone do that?
30 minutes or more after the officers had gone to the motel to get John, a couple of them came back and they said, "There's been a homicide." It was devastating. It was, I couldn't believe it. It sort of hits you like a ton of bricks.
And when Glendale police contact the company's corporate office, they discover that the suspects might also be connected to another case. A double homicide that occurred 2,500 miles away at their store in Hanahan, South Carolina, just 1 week earlier.
The two departments get together to compare notes, and the similarities between the two crimes are undeniable.
There are also very good evidence of modus operandi. It's the same motive for both murders. And Sims said on the phone, "This is Mitch." So that was another clue right there.
Investigative teams tear that motel room apart. They eventually find one conclusive piece of evidence that ties the murders together.
It had very clearly been cleaned of any forensic evidence, but they did find one fingerprint on the inside of a toilet paper roll that matched to Mitchell Sims.
Once police have a suspect, they contact Corey Spearoff to identify him.
We learned probably in the next day or two that police contacted us and said, something similar happened a week ago in South Carolina. We have some potential suspects, and we'd like you to look at some pictures. 6 or 8 pictures on a page. As soon as they opened up that book and showed those pictures, it was him first. He jumped right off the page. There was no question, no doubt that was the individual.
Investigators are no longer looking for armed robbers. They're on the hunt for a pair of serial killers.
Both states have had innocent citizens cut down in the prime of their lives. There's no question that Mitchell Sims committed these horrible crimes.
This wasn't about robberies. This was about making employees suffer. The way that he killed them was, in fact, torture.
John Harrigan's delivery truck is missing from the scene, and it looks like Mitch and Ruby may have taken it to flee the scene.
California police immediately issue a nationwide alert for the missing truck and the couple.
The FBI had already put his picture on all of the TV channels throughout America. And then it even got bigger, and he was getting ready to be put on the FBI's 10 most wanted list.
Coming up, investigators receive an anonymous tip, but can they catch the fugitives before they strike again?
The media had a field day with this case. They were like a modern-day Bonnie and Clyde.
Investigators from multiple law enforcement agencies around the United States are working around the clock to locate two suspected murderers, 25-year-old Mitchell Sims and his 20-year-old girlfriend, Ruby Paget.
It got a lot of attention from the press at the time. It was a sensational case. It was all over the news, all over the newspapers, the TV, the radio.
It became interesting because, number one, there were multiple killings, and secondly, involved a national corporation. The corporation took a very keen interest in this.
To assist in the search, Domino's Pizza offers up a $100,000 reward for any information leading to their capture.
I understood that this is a company that believes in its people, takes care of its people. They really stepped up with a substantial reward for the capture of these individuals.
I think they recognize that we need to bring to justice whoever is killing our innocent employees.
Nobody knew where they were. So there was real concern in the company, for sure, that it might happen again.
10 days later, on December 21st, officers in Las Vegas, Nevada, find an abandoned truck in a casino parking lot.
They run the plates and discover it's John Harrigan's missing truck. It had been wiped down just like the motel room, but inside they found John's uniform and his name tag.
So that tipped the police off to their general location.
Investigators immediately shift all the media attention to the Las Vegas area.
His photo was on television, on the news. There'd been a media blitz about the pizza killers being in Las Vegas area.
It doesn't take long for the move to pay off. Just before midnight on Christmas Eve, police receive an anonymous tip that Mitch and Ruby are holed up in a motel nearby.
I went out there and checked with the clerk, and when I described him and he had seen the photo on television, he says, well, yeah, it could be him.
It's around 2 a.m. and Las Vegas police surround the motel. If it is Mitch, they don't know how he's going to react. They don't know if he's going to go out in a blaze of glory.
We went in naturally at gunpoint because he was allegedly armed and dangerous. I had one officer out back and one in front. So we walked up to the door, got beside it. I knocked at the door.
The officers are ready for anything, but thankfully, the encounter doesn't end in violence.
The door opened and Mitch just puts his hands up. Ruby's sitting on the bed behind him.
He was very serene. I mean, he didn't say anything. She was basically the same way. It probably went down as the easiest arrest I ever made. I was kind of surprised at that.
I think they realized that they were completely outnumbered and there was all this firepower and automatic weapons facing them.
When they started checking and doing a search in the room, they looked under the mattress and there was the gun.
They still had the murder weapon in their possession, as well as the cash bag from the robbery in Glendale.
Almost 3 weeks after the first Domino's shooting, the suspects are finally in custody. But despite the couple's timid behavior, police discover evidence that their crime spree had been far from over.
On a table by the bed, they'd noticed some pages torn out of a phone book, and they'd circled some pizza places in the area like they were planning their next robbery.
Oh, it's 100% they were going to commit more murders.
Investigators are quick to notify surviving victims of the arrest.
A few days after I had made the identifications, I then went back to Michigan for Christmas. And it was Christmas Day, the phone rang, And it was someone telling me that he'd been captured in Las Vegas.
Mitchell Sims and Ruby Paget are immediately brought in for questioning. While Mitch remains tight-lipped, Ruby decides to tell investigators everything.
She has no problem throwing her boyfriend under the bus. She says it was all his idea and goes into great detail about how he killed John Harrigan.
Sims and Paget started the day by casing the store in Glendale. They then went to a store where they bought rope and a knife. That night, at their hotel room, they ordered pizza to be delivered to the room, but it was a trap from the beginning.
As soon as John Harrigan walked into that motel room, Mitch attacked him. He kneed him in the stomach and then robbed him at gunpoint.
This young man didn't resist at all. He was compliant.
Ruby says Mitch didn't want to shoot John because of the noise, so he decided to tie him up instead.
They wanted to leave him at the motel, but the plan got more complicated as time went on.
Sims shoved a sock in his mouth and then tied a rag around that sock so he could barely breathe.
They filled the tub with water and dumped Harrigan inside it. He never had a chance.
I think Mitchell kind of panicked in the sense that the reason that he was fingered in the South Carolina homicides was that there was a surviving victim.
She claimed Mitch held Harrigan's head under the water until he was sure he was dead. They then went back to the pizza store and robbed it.
Ruby Paget never took any responsibility for the murder. She said she just went along for the ride and basically blamed Sims.
The witnesses, however, don't see it that way.
She was a knowing participant. She was actively involved. I think the two of them they fed off each other very much. I think one made the other worse and vice versa.
The couple are charged with multiple crimes in 2 different states. But can prosecutors convince a jury to convict them both? Coming up, Mitchell Sims and Ruby Paget stand trial for murder.
To me, the fact cried out literally for the death penalty.
After a month-long manhunt, Mitchell Sims and Ruby Paget have finally been arrested in Las Vegas, Nevada. Although their crime spree began in South Carolina, prosecutors ultimately decide to begin with the case in Glendale, California.
We wanted them to come back here immediately because the first killing was here. However, California had a better case against Ruby than we had.
Ruby Paget was not on the radar for anything. She wasn't involved in the South Carolina murders to anyone's knowledge. So she really came on the radar when she was involved with the Glendale murder and attempted murders.
The charges were 3 counts of armed robbery, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 1 count of first-degree murder with special circumstances.
If convicted, Ruby faces life in prison, and Mitchell could get the death penalty.
The prosecution didn't seek death to her because the facts related to her involvement were very different than Sims' involvement.
Lawyers representing the couple decide to separate them. Ruby is the first to stand trial in January of 1987. The 21-year-old pleads not guilty.
Her defense was that she was in the motel room, but, she did not help Mr. Sims in any way. She had no idea he was going to do that.
The prosecution theory at trial was that Paget had to be an active participant because it would have been too difficult for Mitchell Sims alone to drag the hog-tied John Harrigan into the bathroom and lift him into the bathtub by himself.
After 6 days of deliberation, the jury returns its verdict. They find her guilty of first-degree murder and armed robbery. But she is acquitted on the 2 counts of attempted murder.
Clearly, Ruby Paget was not the leader in this escapade. Sims was the one who was the former employee who held the grudge.
I think the jury felt some sympathy for her, and instead of giving her the death penalty, they gave her life in prison without the possibility of parole.
On March 10th, 1987, Mitchell Sims' trial begins.
The prosecution described him as an angry and violent man who was out seeking revenge, but once he started killing people, he got a taste for it.
It's indicative of Mitchell Sims feeling like he's the aggrieved person. He's been wrong, and the way for him to regain his power is to make other people the victims.
Mitchell's attorneys don't attempt to prove his innocence. Instead, they focus on removing the death penalty.
The special circumstances of Harrigan's murder was the plan to lure him into a trap, but they claim that wasn't the case.
They were arguing it was an accident, that they didn't tie him up in such a way that he couldn't get himself out if he wanted to.
And while the autopsy listed strangulation as the cause of death, drowning could not be ruled out as an additional cause.
The defense theory was that there was no intent to kill John Harrigan, that John Harrigan died accidentally when he struck his head in the bathtub and fell unconscious in the water that was running. But it was a preposterous defense.
The jury doesn't believe it either.
That was ridiculous because he had a ligature mark in his neck deep enough that he was probably already passed out. I didn't have any doubt. I knew he did it.
On May 20th, 1987, Mitchell Sims is found guilty on all charges.
At sentencing, Mitch's lawyers tried to argue that he shouldn't be completely held responsible for his crimes because of a history of childhood abuse.
Mitchell Sims' family background was one of the most horrific that I've encountered in my entire career as a forensic psychiatrist. There was, by his stepfather, verbal abuse, physical abuse, which were beatings of Mitchell with his fists.
The defense claims that when Mitchell was 7 years old, his now deceased stepfather also began sexually abusing him.
This occurred over a prolonged period of time, and as a result, Mitchell became so traumatized and reclusive that he oftentimes just sat staring into space.
It had apparently gotten worse over time. They claim that Mitch's stepfather had apparently forced him to have sex with one of his sisters and his mother.
We heard the testimony about Sims and his horrible childhood. It was one of the worst I've heard. If there was any disagreement between jurors, it was during the penalty phase.
But in the end, the jury's decision was unanimous.
They voted for the death penalty, and at that time in California, that meant the gas chamber.
My thought process was, he killed John Harrigan. He was 21 years old. He was just starting his life. But on top of that, he had brothers and sisters who didn't kill anybody.
I was there when the death sentence was handed down. For me, it was very much a relief. It was a closing chapter on this whole thing.
Mitch is then tried in South Carolina for the murders of Chris Zare and Gary Melky. The results are the same.
I've been around a lot of people who've been guilty of murder. He was very callous. I've never seen somebody so cold.
The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before finding him guilty. That resulted in a second death penalty.
But no punishment could ever help the families of the victims make sense of their loss. What started as a bitter man's need for revenge had escalated into a murder spree that devastated countless lives.
A lot of people, they're promised the jobs, they get cheated out of a bonus. They quit their jobs and move on. Mitchell Sims didn't do that. He decided to take out his vengeance.
I still remember it, and I still remember the incredible loss that occurred with just outstanding individuals and the tremendous, horrible ramifications that it had with their families.
Had Melky not survived the shooting, and if he wasn't able to tell the cops that Mitchell Sims did it, who knows how many more murders Sims would have committed across the entire country.
They were high school sweethearts building a better life together.
My dad was a father that you would just dream of having. Same thing with my mom.
We decided, we're going to buy a home. And this one in Calypso Lane, we kept coming back to it.
Until a neighborhood dispute spiraled out of control.
This is trespassing. You're going to jail for that, asshole.
It was a testosterone fight that just wouldn't stop. And it just got worse and worse.
And when the battle leaves one of them dead, police must determine whether it was justified or a final act of revenge.
People are screaming, "The shooter's in the house!"
We should not be afraid of being killed by our neighbors.
On September 24th, 2011, it's a quiet evening in the bedroom community of Canyon Country, California, until the sheriff's office receives an alarming call around 3 a.m.
911? Yes, my neighbor. Somebody got shot. Do you know who was shot? I don't know their names. I heard 2 shots and then ran up there.
Deputies arrive minutes later to find a chaotic scene.
There's a crowd of neighbors. They're in their pajamas. Everybody's screaming, yelling. There's chaos.
People are screaming, "The shooter's in the house! The shooter's in the house!" They're pointing and yelling at this house.
The arriving deputy sheriffs didn't know what was going on. They perceived a person that had been shot laying very close to the front door.
They were told that the suspect was armed and was still inside the house. Some of the neighbors were hysterical.
Realizing how dangerous the situation is, the officers immediately call for backup and secure the area.
They were trying to figure out who the victim was, where the shots had come from, and what to do about it. This was about one of the most bizarre, frightening experiences they had had. They still had a potential active shooting situation. Their policy and protocol was not to let in treating paramedics.
They'll stage, but they will not come to the scene until law enforcement tells them that it's safe.
The victim needed to be moved out of a potential kill zone onto the driveway, so the people that were administering aid helped drag him to what they believed to be a safer area.
While medics try to stabilize the victim, arriving officers learn the shooter is believed to be in the house and set up a perimeter.
They had their guns drawn, and they were ready to shoot anybody that opened the front door.
By this time, law enforcement has been able to identify the victim on the ground.
There's a man bleeding out. His wife is there. She tells police, "This is my husband. This is Tony Davis."
Raised in Glendale, California, Anthony Davis was instilled with a blue-collar work ethic from an early age.
Tony learned roofing when he was in high school. He was a roofer. And he ran his own little business for a while.
High school is also where he'd meet the love of his life, Cindy.
I was 15 and Tony was 16. I used to ride my horse up through town, and I guess I caught his attention. There was one day I was walking, and I hear him come out, and I knew that boy liked me. And that's where it started.
It would take 11 years and 2 children for Tony and Cindy to make it official.
We first moved in together when I was 17 and Tony was 18, I believe. I worked in retail for a while, then went on to office management. So, started having babies at age 20. My son was my firstborn, and then my daughter 4 years later.
And we were just all a tight-knit family.
Tony and Cindy worked hard to provide for their family, and Tony moved on from working as a roofer to become a truck driver. But in 1991, tragedy struck.
At 35, he decided he was going to go and get his CDL and drive a truck. He did okay there, but he had an accident during those years, and he about lost his leg. He had a crush injury is what he had.
It was a really, really serious injury that caused him to have to undergo several surgeries.
After the wreck, it took 5 years for Tony to recover well enough to walk, but he would never be able to drive a truck again.
Tony was in his late 30s. He had to reinvent himself. He had to provide for his family and put clothing on his children's backs.
Tony enrolled in college at Cal State University Northridge and began a career in teaching. the Davises decided to make another change as well.
2003 is when we decided, we're going to buy a home. Every day when Tony got off work, he would go hunting. And this one in Calypso Lane, we kept coming back to it.
He just said, this is it. And he took my mom up there, and it became a dream come true. And when we walked in, my dad said, this is going to be our house.
This was the Davises' dream home. It was the first home that they had bought together as a married couple.
But almost 9 years later, the Davises' neighborhood has become a crime scene after Tony was found shot in front of the house next door. The gunman is believed to be holed up inside, and police have the area surrounded.
The deputy sheriff was trying to make commands for the person inside, or persons, to reveal themselves, to come out of the house, to give up, lay down their weapons.
They're armed and ready, and they have no idea what to expect.
Coming up, as paramedics try to save Tony's life, police come face to face with an assailant.
They're very nervous about what he's going to do.
Because it happened very fast.
"51-year-old Tony Davis has been found shot in his Santa Clarita neighborhood. Police are in a standoff with the gunman, and EMTs are fighting to save Tony's life amidst the active crime scene.
They didn't know what the situation was on the inside of the house, other than at least one person who had a gun, who had just shot somebody, was on the inside.
But just as officers prepare to storm the house, the door suddenly opens.
The, at this point, alleged shooter acts very bizarrely. He's not coming out. He's not listening to orders to come out. He opens the door and he says, "You come in."
Which they weren't quite sure was an invitation or a threat.
They can see that he's not armed, so they decide to go into the house, and they find two people inside.
They perceive a male and female in their 50s inside the house.
Police quickly handcuff the couple while they conduct a search of the house.
The first thing that happens is the man, the suspected shooter, complains that his cuffs are too tight. So as one of the deputies is loosening the grip of the cuffs, he blurts out something rather unusual. He says, "This is the first time I've had to discharge my weapon in anger, and I was in the Army."
Once the deputies made entry into the house, they did a protective sweep. They made sure there was no other imminent threat.
In the course of that, they see a shotgun sitting on the couch. Apparently no attempt to try to hide this weapon. There it is.
Officers transport them both to the Santa Clarita Valley Sheriff's Station for questioning. The couple is identified as 51-year-old Lonnie Paul Tracy and his wife Sandra.
They felt that while they sorted things out, the safest course would be to take them back to the station out of potential harm of angry neighbors, etc.
Meanwhile, paramedics outside are trying to keep Tony alive, but his injuries prove to be too severe.
He had a big gaping hole in his chest. I did not see the hole that was in his back until after the coroner arrived and when they turned him over.
They did everything they could to try and save his life, but it was a tough road to hoe.
Tony's family is devastated by the news of his death.
You're in shock, and the only one I wanted was my daughter. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do.
I just had fallen asleep, and I got woken up by my husband. He goes, "Your mom called." There was a voicemail, and it was my mom screaming. And at that point in time, I knew that my dad had died.
While the coroner removes Tony's body for an autopsy, detectives Gene Okada and Gib Anderson are assigned to the case and begin searching the home of the shooter, Lonnie Tracy.
One of the first things they noticed was that the Tracy's home sticks out like a sore thumb. It's kind of an eyesore.
There was a 6-foot-high fence that paralleled the walkway. That was unusual.
It didn't bear any resemblance to most fences. It did have some kind of tactical bearing to it.
It's what law enforcement would call a kill zone, because you're enclosed between the garage and this fence.
An examination of the walkway turns up several pieces of evidence.
I saw 2 shell casings, maybe about 2-3 feet in front of the front door. I saw blood, and I saw the drag marks, so they had pulled into the front of the garage.
They also noticed that the home was outfitted with 4 surveillance cameras and a makeshift security system.
There was an extension cord running from the garage, and it connected by power this infrared light.
The infrared light was on the fence and pointed toward the Davis's home. It seemed intentional.
And inside the Tracy's home, detectives find a small room that appears to be some kind of command center.
In that side room is all this technology for surveillance cameras and stacks and stacks and stacks of tapes and photographs and documents, as if someone from the CIA lived in this home.
He had what I think is commonly known as a splitter, so he could see 4 cameras at once, and there was a monitor that was on.
At this point in an investigation, investigators would typically collect all of the evidence and send it to a forensic lab.
Based on their extreme security measures targeting the Davis family, the Tracys seem to be acting as though the Davises are their mortal enemies. And Cindy Davis tells detectives there's a very good reason why.
As it turns out, there was a lot of bad blood between these 2 families, the Davis family and the Tracy family. And Cindy Davis actually says that she had a feeling that something exactly like this was going to happen.
When I talked to the victim's wife, it was almost like, now what? What's going to happen next? She had her guard up, but she was able to talk and tell us the story that had been happening between her and her neighbors.
Coming up, investigators learn the details of a vicious rivalry that's been building for years.
Lots of volatility between the 2, things that have been done to each other.
They were 2 peas in a pod. They just couldn't let things go.
Police investigating the death of Tony Davis have learned that the shooting might be the result of an ongoing feud with his neighbor, Lonnie Paul Tracy. According to Cindy Davis, the dispute started a couple of years after they moved into the neighborhood in 2003.
She tells them that they never really liked each other that much, the 2 families, perhaps in the beginning, when they were new neighbors. But there was an incident.
Tony's style was easygoing, and we did have an issue when we first moved there about a bowing fence a little bit. And so he went over and he knocked on the neighbor's door, which there was no answer. So he decided to leave a little, I believe it was a Post-it note, and said, "Hi, this is your neighbor. Could you please not lean the tire up against the fence?" I mean, it was a huge tire. It wasn't like a car tire. It was more like a really big semi-tire.
Cindy says the Tracys never moved the tire, but a little while after that, there was an attempted break-in late at night.
There was another incident involving my son. He heard something in the garage, and he had came and woke Tony and I up, and we went out there, and you heard the neighbor's door close. We went in the garage, nothing was missing, but there was definitely somebody there.
And Cindy tells investigators that over the next few years, things only got stranger.
We would come home from work, and there would be citations on our door from animal control stating that our German Shepherds were running wild in the neighborhood. And it would be like That's not true.
One of the citations claimed that the Davises' dog jumped the fence and tried to bite a child.
But according to Cindy, their dog was not on the property, not outside their own home on the date and time that Mr. Tracy insisted that this happened.
We went down to the animal control and addressed the issue and just said, this isn't true. What do you need me to do? And it's like, who are these people? And they were relentless. And being that there was never no proof, it was basically just dropped.
Once again, Tony tried to talk to Lonnie, but he wouldn't even open the door.
He wasn't like a person you could go and have a conversation with him and ask him, what am I doing that offends you? You know, let's work this out like two grown adults. It wasn't that way. Instead, he would do these crazy things.
Cindy says that by 2007, the citations had gotten out of hand, and Lonnie had started recording their alleged infractions.
Some of those complaints could be something like somebody's lawnmower went 2 feet over the line, a dirt clod was found in the backyard that they wanted held as evidence.
This is trespassing after he's been warned with a court order. He's been told 3 times. His name is Anthony Davis. That's him. That's what he just did. Police are being called. Go call the police.
Our trash cans were in public view, and it is a city ordinance that you shouldn't have trash cans in public view. But if you drive around Santa Clarita, Glendale, LA, you're going to see somebody's trash can. And most people don't care.
But when she and Tony discovered the windshield of their car had been shattered, they decided it was time to fight fire with fire.
They were frankly fed up, and they did fight back at times. There's no doubt about it.
The Santa Clarita Valley Station personnel had many phone calls, letters, etc., with both neighbors making accusations against the others.
That only made matters worse.
Tony had gotten his bachelor's degree, and I decided that we were going to have a little party at our home. So we invited some of his colleagues and some few family members and set the backyard up really nice. And we're out there having a good time. And the next thing I know, Tracy next door picks up his blower and he just starts blowing, and the dirt is just coming over into our yard.
My dad just simply walked over there and asked him, "What are you doing?" And no response, just a blower, and more dust came up. I think Mr. Paul Tracy was trying to antagonize my father, and when he didn't get any type of reaction that he wanted, things progressively got worse.
The final straw came that June, when Cindy says they caught Lonnie taking pictures of them.
My dad and I, we were just sitting on one of the walls in the front yard, and we were just talking. I don't remember what we were talking about, but Mr. Tracy came out and just started taking pictures of us. And my dad just simply looked at me and said, "Jamie, let's go inside."
He had more family photos of Tony and I and my family than I probably ever have. It was just nuts. And so we went and we got a restraining order.
However, the Tracys responded by taking out a restraining order against them.
While Cindy and Tony Davis were a united front in their allegations against the Tracys, so were the Tracys in their allegations against the Davises.
All they did was take the same words that Tony and I put and put their name on it, word for word.
Instead of putting an end to the hostilities, the restraining orders only added fuel to the fire. But no one could have known how hot it would get.
It just festered. Just like any feud, it gets getting worse and worse.
Coming up, the battle between the Tracys and the Davises finally explodes.
Neither of these men had the emotional tools to say, "Wait a minute, this is insane."
investigators in Santa Clarita, California, are learning about the volatile feud that may have caused 51-year-old Lonnie Tracy to shoot his neighbor, Tony Davis.
The guys had petty complaints back and forth. Primarily, that's the ones that were keeping this feud alive. And this had gone on, I was kind of shocked to learn, for probably at least 7 years.
So what you have here, besides a failure to communicate, is you have essentially grown men acting like 7-year-olds.
Despite restraining orders against both families, the feud only continued to intensify.
There was an increasing escalation between one side and the other. It was sometimes bizarre.
Get the fuck off of our property.
I'm not on the property, I'm on the sidewalk.
You're a fucking maniac.
Just call the police.
On another occasion, Cindy was gardening. She puts her keys up on a fence on a hook. She returns to get the keys. They're not there.
I'm looking in the flower bushes, running around thinking, what'd I do with these keys, knowing darn well I'd put them where I'd put them.
The next day, Cindy discovered someone had vandalized her car. Certain it was the Tracys, Cindy tried filing another report with the sheriff's department.
Unless you have proof, law enforcement can't get involved in something like, I think he did it.
Just like it happened with the restraining order, this caused a flurry of reports in response. Every time the Davises tried to report something to police in their own defense, Tracy's fired back with their own report.
Some of those were like vandalizing cars, scratching cars, changing their location of the mailbox simply to hassle the other person's parking, those kinds of things.
It almost made it seem like the Tracys just sat around thinking of ways to get back at the Davis family. It made it seem as if they were mean, angry people.
Cindy tells police that by early 2011, she and Tony had decided the only way to stop Lonnie Tracy was to catch him in the act.
The Davis family, because they felt that they had been victimized over and over again, decided to do something about it, and so they installed pretty state-of-the-art surveillance around the entire perimeter of their house.
Once again, he just one-ups them and installs his own surveillance cameras. It's almost like anything you can do, I can do better.
Add to that, he's placed flood lamps all around his house, which are aimed right in Tony Davis's and Cindy Davis's bedroom.
Cindy says that's when their dispute took a bizarre turn.
Lonnie Tracy had a bunch of really bizarre posters made and intentionally put them where the Davises couldn't help but see them.
He writes on these posters the most rude, obscene, lewd, vile, and absolutely imbecilic statements about Tony Davis that you can imagine.
If you want to see a whale, if the tours start tomorrow, it was terrible.
It was a little disturbing that someone would take the time to do that.
Still, the Davises tried to keep the peace. But when Lonnie installed his infrared light, Tony finally decided enough was enough.
Even though the infrared light couldn't be seen with the naked eye, it actually did disrupt the Davises' camera signals. That's exactly why Tony Davis went to his neighbor's house 3 a.m. the night of the shooting.
I'd fallen asleep watching soap operas, and he had went into the security cameras and noticed that one was being blocked out, and he had woke me up and said, Cindy, I'm going to go next door and just ask him to turn off the lights. I just said, okay.
She didn't know what he meant by that, and then she went back to sleep.
A few minutes later, Cindy would be awakened once again, this time by 2 gunshots.
When she realized that her husband was not in the house, she ran out, went immediately to the Tracy's front yard.
Cindy saw her husband laying within the perimeter of the L-shaped fence. He had been shot, he was crying, and he was still alive.
I went to go to Tony, and the door flung open, and the man pointed the shotgun at me and told me to get the fuck off his property.
She ran back, dialed 911. She was hysterical at this time.
Cindy agrees to hand over all of the surveillance video they recorded that night. Investigators are hopeful it will give them a clearer picture of exactly what happened.
Now that detectives have heard Cindy's side of the story, they head back to the station to get more information from the Tracys.
Coming up, cold-blooded murder or justifiable self-defense.
She said the next-door neighbors were the neighbors from hell.
I've never lived next to such horrible beings in my life.
Cindy Davis has told police about an alarming feud that left her husband Tony dead. Now it's time for them to talk to the shooter, Lonnie Tracy, and his wife, Sandra. 9 hours after the shooting, detectives sit down with Sandra Tracy to get her side of the story.
According to her, they weren't the ones harassing the Davises. It was the other way around.
I've just called them the neighbors from hell forever.
But as much as the two families hated each other, they seemed to have a few things in common.
Lonnie was once employed as a commercial artist, and then he had a very, very serious accident.
He crashed into a sign with his knee and tore the meniscus. We've been living in workers' compensation hell for the last 9 years.
By all rights, they should have been best friends. They were living right next to each other. They were similarly aged. They both had had devastating workplace injury where they were on long-term workers' comp, off of work, with their days open.
Sandra had many of the same complaints that Cindy did, except in her version, it was the Davises who were the instigators.
She said they erected that fence in front of their house so that people from the street couldn't look into their bedroom.
Sandra tells investigators that when the Davises installed cameras to watch them, they had no choice but to respond in kind.
They had to put up their own surveillance systems to counteract the neighbors' surveillance system. The feud was back and forth, the petty things that they did to each other.
Sandra claims Tony Davis became increasingly volatile, leading to an incident in April of that year.
Lonnie had filed a police report claiming that Tony assaulted him while he was mowing the front lawn.
And then all of a sudden he'd feel something hit him on the head and shoulders, and he was throwing things at him. He just picked up mounds of dirt that had rocks and crap in it, and he was spraying my husband with the hose.
There you go again, folks. There's a fucking water hose right there.
Mr. Tracy thought that constituted assault and battery, and the DA had declined to prosecute.
From that time on, April, Davis has been very emboldened that he can get away with anything. And just more and more stuff started happening. I've been very afraid of this man. I've told the police this for years.
But when it comes to the shooting, Sandra tells investigators she didn't actually see it happen.
Sandra's story was she was sleeping, and she knows that her husband is also a night owl, and he was probably tinkering around in his room with model cars.
I had gone in to go to the bathroom. All of a sudden, he's screaming at me, "Call the police! Call the police!" I said, "What's happening?" He says, "Somebody's out here. I'm hearing sounds. There's lights."
She runs back into the bedroom to call police and describes what she hears as a loud banging.
Like either a pounding or something hit the door with a lot of force. A lot of force. It was very loud.
And then what happened next?
I hear shots. And I'm going, "Oh my God, what's happening? What's happening?"
Her husband told her that someone was trying to break into her house, to the front door.
She immediately calls 911, and she's still on the phone with them when Lonnie starts screaming that he's shot the prowler.
she was not aware initially that it was, in fact, Mr. Davis.
Detectives aren't sure what to make of Sandra's story.
Was this a legal and case of self-defense, or was this a murder?
Since her statement was that she was in the bedroom, she heard the shots and came out, there was no reason to arrest her, so we let her go.
Unfortunately, her husband isn't as cooperative.
I would rather have an attorney present.
The fact that the deputies came into his home, they detained him at gunpoint. He seemed a little miffed that this is the way he was treated when he felt in his mind that he had acted appropriately.
Since investigators only have 48 hours from the time of arrest to file charges, they're faced with a decision.
We had the murder weapon. We also had Lonnie's statement that this is the first time that he's ever shot a gun in anger since the Army.
He certainly had hate and animus for his next door neighbor.
After Mr. Tracy declined to speak to us, we directed the deputies to go ahead and book him for the charge of murder.
Police also charged Lonnie with assault for threatening Cindy Davis with a shotgun. Now they needed to make sure they had the evidence to prove it.
They start by going back through all of the complaints that had been filed with the sheriff's department.
It was really unbelievable to see just the volume of petty complaints back and forth over a period of approximately 7 years.
When you see the reports one after another through the years, you could see that it was building to some sort of climactic result or conclusion.
Investigators also pore over the endless hours of surveillance tape both families collected. And what they find is revealing.
In this case, surveillance tape was paramount, and it was the Fort Knox of evidence.
He was following my wife. We've had all kinds of vandalism. There's only one place it comes from. Anthony Davis.
Coming up, Lonnie Tracy takes the stand in his own defense. But will it help his case or hurt it?
You always want somebody to give a statement so you could foresee what they're going to say. Here, I had no idea.
In October of 2012, Lonnie Tracy stands trial for the murder of his neighbor, Tony Davis. The prosecution describes Lonnie as a man whose resentment drove him to do the unthinkable.
He had this pent-up frustration. He was basically homebound. He was in a lot of pain. Unfortunately, the person that he was able to spew his venom at was his neighbor, Mr. Davis.
Prosecutors used physical evidence from the scene, along with a substantial amount of video surveillance evidence to describe what happened the night of the shooting.
The video for the Tracy residence, you saw Mr. Davis arrive. You could see that he was near the L-shaped fence.
Some of it was grainy, but you still get a pretty clear picture, and it looked like he did act to unplug an infrared light that was mounted on the Tracy's wall.
The surveillance tape shows Tony Davis actually walking up to the front door.
Although the cameras didn't pick up the actual shooting, detectives testify that Lonnie could easily see it was Tony through the monitors in his house.
It appeared the final straw in Tracy's mind when Mr. Davis had the gall to come into his yard and disrupt the device that he had put up to disrupt the Davises' video system, and that was more than he could bear.
Detectives believe that Lonnie grabbed his gun with the intention of going to the front door and shooting Tony. And when he shot him, the bullet hit him in the chest.
You can see some haze, which looks like pellets from a shotgun. Then you see Mr. Davis trying to apparently flee as best he could through the front walkway.
They say that's when Lonnie shot Tony in the back, and the medical examiner's report seems to back up that theory.
However, the defense insists that Lonnie was well within his rights to shoot an intruder. And in a surprising move, Lonnie even decides to speak out on his own behalf.
His version was that he heard a noise in the front yard. He took his shotgun to protect himself and his family.
And he can't really make out what's going on because the light's flashing through the windows. And he doesn't know who it is. And no one's ever shown up at his doorstep at 3 a.m.
He testified that he opened the door and that he was bull rushed into the interior of his house.
He ultimately felt that he had to shoot the person. He didn't realize it was his neighbor until later.
Lonnie claims he never threatened Cindy Davis with the gun. She just interpreted it that way.
He told her simply to get off the property and that law enforcement was about to arrive.
He said essentially the same thing about his comment to police, that this was the first time he had shot his weapon since the Army. It's just that they misinterpreted him.
He was simply stating that he had shot his gun, not that he had done it with any malice or anger.
But the prosecution is quick to poke holes in Lonnie's story.
Mr. Tracy didn't even bother to prepare his statement and make sure that it at least was consistent with facts.
All the forensic evidence, the shell casings, the blood, was all discovered outside the home, completely discounts Lonnie Tracy's conviction that he had to fight off this prowler inside his home.
Not only could he have seen Tony on the cameras, Lonnie would have known that it was Tony the second he opened the door.
For him to say that he didn't recognize him was less than truthful.
Prosecutors argued that Lonnie was just waiting for his chance to get Tony, and that night, opportunity presented itself.
Mr. Tracy executed him. He was his own judge, jury, and executioner.
The jury agrees. On November 7th, 2012, they find Lonnie Tracy guilty of first-degree murder.
Mr. Tracy was subsequently sentenced 50 years for the murder and another 14 years for the attempted murder of Mrs. Davis.
What I remember about the trial is what a coward he was. Couldn't look you in the eyes. Never had an ounce of remorse. How it was, he didn't do nothing. It was everybody else's fault.
Justice seems to have been served, but it's cold comfort for the Davis family, whose dreams had been shattered by a simple neighborhood argument.
These two guys that should have been best friends ended up destroying each other's lives. One literally, and the other one is going to be spending the rest of his life in prison. Over what? Nothing.
My father always turned the cheek and was a man of respect. And for what has happened with that man, could never bring back my father, but that man never deserves to be somebody else's neighbor.
Tony's not here physically. And that's pain. That hurts. But he lets us know he's here. So, and that gives you some sort of peace.